now. Fantastic, thank you very much. I remembered because I usually forget, so I'm quite pleased with myself. Hi John, good afternoon to you too. Right, so welcome everyone to this really special event, which is a joint event, so I'm very happy to say, between the Horror Studies SIG, the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG, and our kind of sister SIG, the Science Fiction and Fantasy BAFTSS SIG. It's really great to have this event, and we put our heads together and thought this would be a really nice occasion. So I know I'm really looking forward to it, and I think we're in for a treat tonight in terms of the kind of discussion, the quality and the breadth of the discussion that we're going to be having. So the event is called Infinite Terror, Science Fiction, Horror and Genre Hybridity. And if you don't know me, I'm Kate Egan. I'm one of the conveners of the BAFTSS Horror SIG, along with the wonderful Laura, me and Shelley McMurdo. And I'm happy to say that all three conveners of the Science Fiction and Fantasy SIG are all on the panel tonight, which is great. And what we'll be doing over the next hour, of course, we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to your comments and questions as well. So as Laura and Shelley are saying in the chat, do keep putting your comments and questions in there throughout, but we'll turn to those and start looking at them and addressing them in the last half an hour of the session. And prior to that, we'll be having a discussion with our panel about a whole range of really fascinating issues relating to the distinctions and overlaps between horror and science fiction, thinking about hybridity, thinking about the dialogues between the two genres across media, across the history of the development of both genres, thinking about industry, thinking about audiences. So, all-encompassing, very rich discussion ahead. So without further ado, I want to introduce our brilliant panel for tonight. So panelists, would you like to put your cameras on? Because I'm feeling quite lonely here on my own. So if you'd like to all put your cameras on so everyone can see you. And I'll just introduce you before we start. So a regular attendee of the Horror Studies SIG events, but also one of the conveners of the Science Fiction and Fantasy SIG is Professor Stacey Abbott, who's Professor of Film and Television at the University of Roehampton. And she's published extensively, of course, on the horror genre in film and TV, but she's also written quite a lot on cult science fiction television, including on The X-Files, Torchwood, Firefly, Star Trek. She's written on the role of special effects as well in horror and science fiction. And she's fortunate enough to teach classes on both horror and science fiction as well. And she's currently doing research on animation and horror, but she says that undoubtedly she'll be drawing on a bit of science fiction in there as well. So welcome to you, Stacey. We've also got another convener of Science Fiction and Fantasy SIG. I'm really happy to welcome to this event, Professor Mark Bould, who's Professor of Film and Literature at the University of the West of England. He's the founding editor of the brilliant journal Science Fiction, Film and Television, and co-edits the Studies in Global Science Fiction book series as well. And his latest book is The Anthropocene Unconscious Climate Catastrophe Culture. So welcome to you as well, Mark. We then got Dr. Ewan Kirkland, who runs the Animation and Games Art and Design degree programs at the University of Brighton. And over the past 10 years, he's written extensively on horror games in particular. So his book on video games and the Gothic was recently published by Routledge. Just ordered it for our library, in fact. And Ewan has also explored science fiction TV, animation audiences and children's cinema. And his most recent project was a study of the uncanny and the wonderful Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. Then we've got Dr. Craig Ian Mann, who's a lecturer in film and media studies at Sheffield Hallam University, another co-convener, the third co-convener of the BAFTSS Science Fiction and Fantasy SIG, and also a founding member of the Horror Studies SIG as well. And he's the author of the brilliant book, Phases of the Moon, A Cultural History of the Werewolf Film. And he's published research on both horror and science fiction in the Journal of Popular Film and TV, Horror Studies and Science Fiction, Film and Television. And he's also, of course, co-founder and co-convener of the fantastic Fear 2000 conference series on contemporary horror media. And you've got the call for the papers has gone out, and I think the deadline's quite soon, isn't it, Craig, in March? So I'll just give that a plug. And finally, last but not least, is Dr. Rebecca Williams, who's an associate professor at the University of South Wales and is the author of a number of brilliant books. The most recent one, Theme Park Fandom, Spatial Transmedia, Materiality and Participatory Cultures, and also Post-Object Fandom, of course. And she's the editor of Fan Studies Primer, Method Ethics Research, Everybody Hurts, and Torchwood Declassified. So what an amazing panel, I'm sure you would agree, and I'm just really pleased to have you all here tonight for this discussion. And I'm going to kick off. I've got lots of questions and lots of ground that I want to cover. But I want to start with a quote from Stephen King from Danse Macabre, where he noted, and this might be a quite snarky way to start, but I thought it might be a nice way of opening up discussion. He argued in Danse Macabre this: it's hard to imagine a more profitless pastime than that of discriminating between horror and science fiction, which is, of course, what we're about to do over the course of this session. So I just wondered, do you all agree with him? Why might people want to distinguish between horror and science fiction, or try and kind of police the borders between the two genres? Stacey, could I start with you?
Yeah, I'm happy to get things going. I'm always happy to respond to snarky Stephen King. I kind of both agree and disagree with King. I mean, as someone who does work in both, I understand the suggestion, like what is the point in kind of policing that line? Like, for me, I think there's something wonderfully hybrid about genre. So, I myself, I'm not that bothered by rigorous lines. I quite like things that blur lines. But the flip side of that is that I kind of do understand, for some people, there is a benefit to distinguishing them. And I was thinking when you were kind of talking about this, I was thinking about kind of markets for these genres, that horror has often been seen as quite disreputable. And we kind of enjoy the disreputableness of horror. And yet science fiction in some areas can be seen as far more reputable. And I think sometimes for people who like particular genres, they don't want to see that. They like to police the lines because they see one as being, well, particularly horror as being disreputable and well, forever low budget or cheap or nasty, versus the kind of more kind of intellectual arguments that sometimes people see in science fiction. And I think so sometimes there's an element where certain audiences or might want to see differences because what they're drawn to in those genres are, they see a difference. And I think that a notion of disreputability and reputability may be one factor, even if that doesn't particularly affect my enjoyment of either.
Okay, but Mark, what do you think? Do you think that's the case?
I think it really depends on what you want to use your definition for, why you're bothering to define and draw distinctions. So, there was a time when I cared about this a lot. I was young and foolish. And now I've become increasingly cavalier about it. I like constantly expanding the borders of genres. So I'm constantly at the moment, because I'm writing about climate change fiction, a couple of the people who are responsible for the term cli-fi constantly trying to draw me into fights on Twitter, because I see the distinction they're drawing as nothing to do with the texts themselves, but entirely about the exercise of cultural capital. So people who like certain varieties of middle brow fiction can pretend the science fiction they're reading isn't really science fiction. So, that's one direction I'd like to pick a fight. But people do have genuine affective attachments to these kinds of generic terms. So again, to bore you autobiographically, when I was first working on African science fiction about a decade ago, there wasn't a lot of work around. A lot of the people working in African science fiction, which really was emerging massively, primarily in Nigeria and South Africa, they didn't like the term Afrofuturism for a variety of reasons. One of them because they thought it associated with them with Italian fascists, which is a perfectly good reason to reject the label. Another because they didn't really quite understand the way futurism was being used in that term. But then the cultural politics became much more complex. Working in the States, African Americans wouldn't accept as Afrofuturism anything that wasn't African American. not all Americans, but there's certainly a distinctive community doing that. And then Nnedi Okorafor and others start introducing the term African futurism. And, you know, I've reached the point now where, you know, this is clearly not just effectively important, but politically important. So those kinds of distinctions, I will absolutely respect the practitioner's wishes. Middlebrow journalists writing for The Guardian about Cli-Fi, I could care less what they think they're talking about. It really is just an exercise of cultural capital, which I'm quite happy to dismiss.
Rebecca, can I bring you in on this as someone who, you know, is interested in audiences and cultural capital and those kind of ideas? You know, what do you think about this? Do you know, from your perspective, as someone who's written on both areas, and particularly with a focus on audiences and fans, you know, why for you? Why do you think it is important for people to distinguish in the way that they do between the genres?
I think it's sort of Stacey sort of mentioned, for a lot of people, there is a very kind of passionate sort of attachment to arguing for being a horror fan, particularly, and also I think science fiction sort of fans. And just to kind of pick up another term that has been talked about a lot, I think, in terms of horror over the last couple of years, the idea of elevated horror, which fills me with some horror to kind of unpack that. But I think, again, it's that idea about people who maybe wouldn't consider themselves horror fans or part of the horror audience. It allows them to enjoy or kind of appreciate horror films in a different way, or for that to be something that they're more comfortable with. And again, a lot of that, I think, comes back to that idea about the disreputability of certain kinds of horror. So liking elevated horror is fine. That's kind of almost kind of mainstream horror now for a lot of audiences. But for a lot of people who are more interested in the much more kind of cult sort of subcultural capital that you would get from that, I think there is still a desire to hold on to that because of the importance of kind of being there, I think, before a lot of films or things became very mainstream, or kind of knowing about things before they happen. And I'm thinking particularly, again, just sort of anecdotally watching the new version of the Texas Chainsaw, the sequel that was on Netflix over the weekend. Quite enjoyed it, you know, it was fine. And a lot of the discussions that I was seeing online, on kind of on Twitter, on Reddit and other places over the weekend, were this idea that the original can't be matched. And if you kind of weren't there, if you didn't see that at the time almost, or you didn't live through that you can't really understand what that film is meant to be like. And so I think for a lot of people, it's about ideas around authenticity. And I think for a lot of people, particularly horror fans, I think science fiction is slightly different because I think it is a lot broader. But I think for a lot of horror fans, it is that idea about being part of quite a specific kind of subculture in different ways. And that's why I think sometimes fans particularly are a little bit resistant at where those genre lines do start to get blurred.
Craig, what do you think? Can I bring you in at this point? Do you agree?
I think it's interesting that quote comes from Stephen King, because Stephen King is of a generation of sort of genre creatives, writers, and even film directors who grew up in, you know, watching the stuff of the 50s. And in the 50s, those distinctions disappeared for the most part. You know, horror was science fiction was horror. I think, you know, Romero, Stephen King, they grew up in watching things like Them and Invasion of the Saucermen and Attack of the 50-Foot Woman and all that kind of stuff. And I think that definitely comes across in King's science fiction output. You know, the Tommyknockers is an alien invasion novel. And you've got Thinner, which is the take on The Incredible Shrinking Man, and The Running Man is basically The Most Dangerous Game. So I suppose all of King's science fiction stuff has an element of horror, and there's that idea that he grew up with science fiction and horror as this intertwined thing. But it doesn't necessarily work the other way around. I think you'd struggle to say that Salem's Lot or The Shining were science fiction, you know. So I think there does come a point at which we have to say that a horror film doesn't contain any science element, or that a science fiction film is in no way horrific. And at that point, I think that there has to be some kind of distinction. But I think they're still sister genres. They cross over very, very often. And I think they broadly appeal to similar groups of people. So on the festival circuit, for example, you'll often see science fiction films at horror festivals. You'll often see horror films at science fiction festivals. So those audiences are kind of interested in the same kinds of movies. And I think when you do get to the point of trying to police the boundaries between those two things, beyond just sort of kind of, the generic thing of, is your science fiction film scary or not, then I think we do get into, cultural capital and that kind of thing. And at that point, I become less interested. I think it's perhaps more of a problem in literature than it is in film, that science fiction is considered to be more worthy or highbrow. But I certainly do think that that's one of the reasons why people would want to police that boundary. Yeah.
It's interesting what you're saying there, Craig, about, that there has to be a point where you say, well, there are horror films that don't have science fiction elements and so on. Because teaching a horror module for quite a number of years, and in the first week, I'd always, at the end of the seminar in the first week, would have a kind of, not a curveball question, but a question just to get people talking, which would be, how do we distinguish between horror and science fiction? And it would just get students talking. And I'd say, I don't know the answer to this question. There is no answer. I just want to know what you think. And it would be fascinating, the kind of answers I get over the years. And that's inspired my kind of second question here, really, which is, that often people try in scholarship, in writing on both genres, to find ways to distinguish them definitively. So a common one will be science fiction is focused on the projection of the future from the present, while horror is focused on the eruption of the past into the present, or that science fiction is more focused on kind of the rational. Both genres trade in the fantastic to some extent, or the otherworldly, but the science fiction is much more focused on thinking about that in terms of the rational, and horror the irrational and the sort of unconscious. I mean, Mark, what do you think of those kind of working distinctions? Do you think that they have value, that they can be useful, or do you think ultimately that they're just too kind of fixed as distinctions to work in practice?
Yes. No, I think, first of all, I just pick on something you say there. It's not that there's no answer, it's that there are lots of answers, and they're all equally satisfactory and equally unsatisfactory. Those kinds of big distinctions that you've mentioned there, I do find really useful and fascinating, not because I think they reveal any kind of truth about genre, but because of the set of problems that they themselves then create and issues that they then create. So they're, of course, like any genre definition, hopelessly and absurdly overreaching generalizations. They run into that corpus definition problem of, you need to know what films are in the genre to be able to decide the characteristics, but to know which ones are in the genre, you need to already know the characteristics. So they replay that in really interesting ways, but it doesn't mean they're useless. And the ones you've cited there, I think, are particularly helpful for a specific reason, and that's that they're comparative. A lot of work on genre ends up just talking about that genre. So, the most tedious parts of my life of, writing about film noir and being told, oh, you must begin by defining film noir, or writing about science fiction and being told, oh, but you must begin with a definition. So you come up with increasingly baroque ways of avoiding definitions. And what very rarely happens in a book devoted to a genre is any thought given to its position within a system of genres. So to the extent that genres exist, and of course they don't, they're just discursive objects, they might be material practices as well, they exist within a system of genres or multiple systems of genres. And so we need to think about genres comparatively, because they won't reveal a truth of the genre, but they will help us model a genre hypothetically to think through it. So the kind of distinction you've given there, I remember reading Vivian Sobchak's Screening Space when the first edition of Screening Space came out. So it's actually part of the earlier version of the book, Limits of Infinity. She does precisely this kind of move by comparing horror movies and science fiction movies, looking at 50s movies, which is a useful way of arranging both of those fields. But where it's actually useful is it helps you process the ways in which a wide array of movies construct monstrosity. And because she goes from these broad definitions to talking about monster movies, which is, of course, always a good thing to do. I'm sure Craig will agree, talking about monster movies. And what happens when you come up with a definition is you don't discover a truth, you don't reveal a truth. What you do is you create a hypothetical model of a genre, which shifts all the relationships within that genre and shifts all the relationships to other genres. So you can see things afresh. So those kinds of definitions you've just given us are complete nonsense, absurdly overreaching, and also really, really useful.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. It's sort of building on that in a way, but also not at the same time, because I think this might not quite gel with what you just said, and I know you do have views on this. This notion, I mean, this is loosely coming from Rick Altman's work on genre. This notion of a kind of spectrum, not thinking so much about systems, but this notion of a spectrum, and that we can think of genre as a spectrum where horror and science fiction are kind of close neighbours, if you like. And then we have this kind of overlap between the two, a family resemblance between the two. And then we have media texts that are kind of located on the border between the two genres. So in terms of thinking about, say, science fiction, film and TV, it would be easier to kind of argue that Alien, to give an off-cited example, or the X-Files would be in that kind of overlap zone. Whereas something like Jurassic Park or 2001 or Quantum Leap or Star Trek wouldn't be. What do people think of that? Do they think that that's a useful way of thinking about, again, about the relationship between the genres? Ewan, what do you think?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really interesting that we haven't really got very far before we've had sort of the whole notion of genre being completely dismissed at the same time as saying, yeah, no, it's actually really quite important to a lot of these discussions. And I mean, I guess that the question is, what are we trying to do here? What exactly are we exploring when we're looking at genre? I mean, I think there is always going to be this tension between, like what you said, the kind of fuzziness of genre, the kind of blurriness, the fact that genres aren't clearly demarked. Most texts are kind of contain multiple genres that work within them. Most films have got some romantic element to them, or a lot of films have comedy in them, but there's maybe a certain theoretical tipping point where something becomes a romantic comedy, so that all the other elements are sort of like pushed out. And I mean, I was just thinking about Shaun of the Dead as an example of a movie which I think in a lot of the promotion was very much put forward as a kind of hybrid romantic comedy horror apocalypse zombie movie. So it was trying to kind of while we quite often talk about genres, talk about text in terms of single genres, actually the industry isn't trying to do that at all. It's trying to sort of hedge its bets, trying to kind of combine as many different audiences as possible. So there are, even within the industry, there are these kind of tensions. On the one hand, you've got an industry that's trying to sort of appeal to lots of people, but then you've also got an industry that is trying to categorize and classify its own products in a way which is also beneficial. So, I mean, I think it still exists. Going to HMV and going to the DVD section, it's clearly divided according to certain kinds of genres. But then when you watch trailers, you can see like they're trying to promote the same. Sometimes you see the same different trailers for the same film, which suggests that the same film belongs to lots of different generic categories depending on what particular audience they're trying to appeal to. So I think it is, on the one hand, it's this very fuzzy, blurry, hybridity. It seems to be the kind of like the characteristic, certainly of film genres. But at the same time, it is a really important, useful thing which we can see in reviews, in fan culture, in promotional media, in interviews with directors, in the kind of just the general discourse which surrounds not just film but other kinds of screen-based popular culture.
Stacy, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with everything Ewan said here. I mean, I think that there is an inherent hybridity to film and television and lots of screen media. I do like the idea of the spectrum. I think there is something about saying that there are some things that lean more in one direction and others, and some that there's more obvious overlap. One of the things I was struck when I was looking, though, is that it also varies from media, because when you were citing examples, while I absolutely agree that, you know, Alien, the X-Files are these wonderfully quintessential kind of texts that we talk about in relation to this, and Star Trek may not be, but in television, in episodic television, there are episodes of Star Trek which I would say that actually lean towards horror, you know, and there are moments where they do embrace that. And I would absolutely say Jurassic Park, while is a action adventure and it's dinosaurs and it's a roller coaster ride event, it's also Jaws. You know, it's to me it's very much horror, and I think so it sometimes it's about perspective, and sometimes it is about thinking about those moments in it where it's where it is leaning into one genre. And I remember seeing Jurassic Park and thinking the scene with the T-Rex was terrifying. Like this, you know, really going, wow, I didn't think Spielberg had this in him. Again, like after Jaws, I thought this was, you know, and yet obviously has the science root to it. So I think the spectrum is useful, but also it does vary depending on the text and the media. And I think television, and we might come on to television a bit more as we go, but I think television does definitely lean into the hybridity even more than cinema because of its episodicness.
Rebecca, can I bring you in as somebody who also does lots of research on television? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think what's, you know, Stacey's point about television's flexibility to play around with genre, I think it is something that makes it quite different. And I think that especially as we see platforms like sort of streaming video on demand services like Netflix, for example, trying to carve out their kind of niches and their audiences. If you think about something like Stranger Things, for example, which I think is a really great example of something that is absolutely tapping into science fiction and horror, as well as the kind of nostalgia for those genres and for a particular kind of sort of representation of that. I think that it allows for that kind of that permeability, that playing around with it in a way that cinema or film doesn't. Even when I mean, if we look at horror as a kind of film genre, it's probably one of the genres that has the most sort of remakes, reboots, sequels, that kind of the multiplicity of certain horror franchises. But it's very rare within those that gets played around with in the same sort of way. And when it does, it's an anomaly, like Jason X, you know, Jason Voorhees goes to space, and we kind of borrow that kind of thing. But that's you know, that's the exception, I think, rather than the rule. And so, yeah, most of the research that I've done around kind of horror has been focused on TV. So I think in terms of looking at their kind of the flexi narrative, the way you can play with character as well, that characters can move from being monstrous to heroic and back again, I think is something that allows for in a way that film maybe doesn't as much.
We'll come back to this issue later. Thanks, Rebecca, because I think there's so much we can talk about in terms of thinking about different media and their relationship to hybridity and the crossover between these genres. But I wanted to, and I know this will be something that Craig will enjoy answering in particular, to think a little bit about, you know, regardless of the media that we're talking about, what might be seen as the kind of common characteristics or themes or ideas that frequently cross the genres in whatever media, in whatever kind of historical period, and that might be seen as being central, you know, whether that's something like Jurassic Park or you know, and I agree, I found that T-Rex sequence terrifying, and I still do every time I teach it. So I kind of look away when I'm showing it to students. You know, what are those kind of key characteristics that seem to be shared, if you like, between the two genres? You know, monsters seem central, you know, and Mark's already referred to that. Maybe also the development of special effects, which is something that Stacey's written about in particular. what do you see as being those kind of key overlapping elements? Can we start, because I know you're very keen to answer this question, Craig, so can we start with you?
I think it starts with, I mean, before we get to monsters, I think it starts with mad science, really, doesn't it? I think, Frankenstein is one of the sort of quintessential texts that combines science fiction and horror, maybe the first science fiction and horror novel. And I think mad science is the thing that dominates science fiction before it's really labeled as science fiction, and especially after the cinematic adaptation of Frankenstein comes out in 1931. So in the 30s, you've got The Invisible Man and The Invisible Ray, and then you've got the Karloff movies with Columbia in the 1940s, and then into the 1950s you get into Alligator People and The Fly, and all the way up to Reanimator and From Beyond. And I think the modern version of those films is Jurassic Park or Ex Machina, or I'd say there's more in common between Frankenstein and Deep Blue Sea than most people would care to admit, I think. So I think mad science is one of the things that really follows through that idea of humankind meddling with things we don't really understand and then creating any number of catastrophes. That's certainly one of the underlying themes, I think, in a lot of SF horror hybrids. In that regard, though, I suppose Frankenstein is the kind of novel or the film that people hold up high, but I would also say that we need to take into consideration Jekyll and Hyde. There'd been so many adaptations of Jekyll and Hyde, even in the silent period, and The Invisible Man in 1933 as well. I think those three novels and their adaptations are really important for launching that whole kind of mad science idea in the SF horror hybrid. And then alien movies and monster movies, and I think monsters are enormously important. And I think it's interesting as well to see how science fiction has borrowed monsters more commonly associated with horror and maybe vice versa. So in the 50s, you've got films about atomic werewolves, for example, taking out the supernatural elements and the silver bullets and the full moons and replacing them with guys who've been injected with irradiated wolf's blood. You've got kind of atomic vampires. And then more recently, and this is something I suppose that Stacy should really speak to, but I think zombies and vampires have become increasingly science fictional, as kind of zombies have been reimagined as kind of viral breakouts, and it all begins with Romero, really, doesn't it? And the idea of zombies from Venus. But yeah, maybe that's where I'll hand over to Stacy.
Stacey, so you have addressed there that whole issue of the importance of Frankenstein, which I think is key, isn't it, in terms of thinking about potentially that being the origin of these kind of overlaps between the genres. But yeah, then Stacey, what are your thoughts? What do you see as being the kind of key overlapping characteristics?
Well, I mean, two things, just to respond to Craig. I mean, I do agree that, and I've written a lot about this, as he knows, ad nauseum, about this idea of kind of the reinvention of monster movies as under the lens of science or through the lens of science. So they all becomes viruses and zombies. Romero does really start that as kind of a key element. But I even argue, and I was teaching this 2 weeks ago, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, one could argue, is a kind of science fictionized version of the zombie. I mean, that's what they are, just a different kind of zombie. It's kind of more the kind of traditional zombie being reimagined. This time it's aliens taking over and controlling people's bodies. And that just kind of keeps going. And then, of course, I would go again in the 1950s, you have Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which is a novel that is reimagining the vampire through science and trying to explain it as a virus, which of course then influences films, Last Man on Earth, Romero. There's a knock-on. So I think there's some really interesting, and we talk about origin texts. I mean, there are little ones out there that are kind of really influencing this kind of hybridity. In terms of other themes, as you were talking, I was kind of scribbling down things. One of the things that I guess I wrote down lots of things. I realized what the undercurrent of what I was thinking of was the body. I think that the body is a theme that kind of preoccupies both science fiction and horror. And there's a lot of overlap in how they deal with it, whether it's science fiction exploring kind of genetic modifications or cyborgs or this kind of changing conception of the body, or whether androids and these kinds of conceptions of what it means to be human. And horror does this again with kind of exploring what does it mean to be human, through transformation into other into monsters or into other things. So I think something about this idea about the boundaries of the body, what that means, both genres play with it and sometimes do different things. Sometimes, as in Alien, which was mentioned, really brings all this together in the kind of wonderful birthing scene of the alien, bursting out of a body. Like, there's something really interesting about the way in which they're both very preoccupied by the boundaries of the body and often pushing those boundaries in interesting ways, sometimes to celebrate the kind of wonder and reimagining of it, and sometimes to look at it kind of horrifically. So those are kind of that was what really struck me.
There's also a lot of people in the chat who are talking about the Terminator and kind of robots and AI, and I suppose that's one of the major monsters of the science fiction horror hybrid. Creating something that we can't control, but just in a technological way instead of something that's organic. So I would add robots as well as aliens to a monster that's absolutely integral to the kind of hybridity between science fiction and horror.
Absolutely.
Ewan, do you agree? Do you agree with those being kind of key characteristics that have been identified there by Craig and Stacey?
I think that the idea of the body is a really kind of central theme here. I mean, I think obviously the discussion of Frankenstein could go on for a very long time, but I think I mean, it is a really interesting text, something which does seem to have two feet either in sci-fi and in horror. But also within thinking about temporality, which I think is something which came up earlier, is you've got this figure who is both a kind of a mad scientist and also a kind of necromancer or an alchemist. So they're both someone who's located in the sort of pre-industrial era and also someone who is mobilizing electricity as a way of animating the dead. And I mean, I guess if I was to sort of say the thing that characterizes both horror and science fiction is that it is all about something outside of the normal that is intruding, and that can be a monster, or it could be a time machine, or it could be a spaceship. There's something which is so you set up normality in the first act, and then something disrupts that, and it's not just like a kind of return of a relative in a drama. It's something which is actually kind of outside of what we understand to be normality. And I guess the question is whether how you justify that normality, how you justify that intrusion. And it can be something which is supernatural, or it can be something which is to do with science fiction as technology. So I guess it's, and one of the things I think we're really interesting thing that seems to be emerging here is that we're talking about how you tell sort of vampire stories to people who don't really believe in vampires anymore, don't really believe in ghosts, but do believe in the potential for radiation to somehow disrupt the body, do believe that a cyborg could come from the future in some kind of imagined world where that kind of technology has been developed. So, and I guess that's what's one of the really interesting things I think about this discussion is we're kind of looking at the ways in which very old stories are constantly being kind of reinvented for audiences who maybe are becoming increasingly cynical. Or you also get the other thing, which I think is really interesting, is the way in which you have the sort of the vampire figure, for example, who is then kind of like defined by huge amounts of law, all these rules and regulations, and almost like they're becoming scientificized, if that's a word. They're becoming part of this kind of like rational world for kind of rational audiences. So yeah, I mean, I think there's some really really interesting kind of connections that all these connections seem to be pointing to something about how these archetypal narratives are being reinvented for contemporary viewers and contemporary readers.
Before we continue with thinking perhaps more about the contemporary or about hybridity, that issue of the kind of the archetypes, I wonder if I could bring Mark in on this. I mean, Frankenstein has come up a number of times as being almost like the key origin text, if you like. I mean, what's your view on that? Do you agree that as our literature specialist here?
I think the way you originally worded the question for us in the prep about see if I can call it up. I've got it here somewhere. I should have answered the spectrum question. I have just made a Captain Scarlet joke. Thinking about Frankenstein as the origin of the overlaps between the two genres, I think that question's really the wrong way round. You know, to the extent that any text is unified, and of course no texts are unified, but to the extent it is, it exists as a text and later these categories get put upon it. It's the kind of move that Bruno Latour talks about in We Have Always Been Modern, where we're faced with all this complexity and interrelation around us, and we insist as humans on, or as modern humans, of putting grids of meanings upon things. And I think that's what we do when we look back to a text like Frankenstein. It exists before science fiction, it exists before horror, and meaningful categories in any way. It exists as a thing of its own. The only sort of meaningful generic category would probably be sort of first Gothic revival or something like that. And I think this is at the core of the issue we're struggling with throughout this conversation, is that how we allow things to be rich and mixed and varied and complex and complicated and contradictory and wrong-headed and vibrant and alive, while also making them objects we can talk about. So that's all I have to offer from a literary perspective. I'm sorry.
Well, it's certainly a lot to offer. You shouldn't apologise. It's an incredible amount of food for thought there. Thank you very much. This might seem a slightly trite question. Hope it doesn't. I hope it's a fun one. But we've talked a lot about examples of texts that are in dialogue in some form or another, whether that's consciously or through reception or categorizations, you know, post that text being produced, that are in dialogue with science fiction and horror. And I just wondered, you know, obviously we've already thrown around a lot of different examples, but are there particular media texts for you that seem to epitomise how horror and science fiction can be combined in illuminating, productive, creative ways? I wonder if we could come to Craig for that first. I know you probably all got views on that.
I think going back to one of the films that Stacy mentioned, one of the ones I kind of noted down was Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And I suppose as an extension of that as well, I'd say The Thing from Another World, and also John Carpenter's The Thing. And kind of connecting with something that Ewan said, it's that idea of something coming from outside of human experience, but very much kind of speaking to human experience. So those films are about trust and us losing trust in each other. And however you read Invasion of the Body Snatchers, whether you think it's about communism or McCarthyism or whatever, it's essentially about aliens kind of arriving here and throwing a cat amongst the pigeons and turning us against each other. And I think that is one of the most interesting themes of those kinds of body snatching narratives. I would throw They Live in there as well, which is one of my favorite films of all time, in terms of kind of aliens coming to Earth and turning us against each other. I would also say The Fly, because I think it's one of the kind of most obvious and best examples of where the mad science narrative eventually went. And also the film from which we took the title of this talk, which is Event Horizon, which just kind of transfers that terror of hell into outer space. So those are the films that I would throw out there, I think.
Yeah, Event Horizon, I watched that again quite recently and didn't like it when I first watched it when it came out, but it's a really fascinating film, definitely. Rebecca, can I turn to you for your thoughts on this, particularly perhaps thinking about television as well as film?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably something that a lot of people would kind of jump to, but for me, I think it's the X-Files. I think the kind of the combination of some really quite startling kind of horrific kind of images in some of the Monster of the Week episodes that are kind of played alongside this much more kind of science fiction based kind of narrative, which comes back to the point about I think about both genres kind of sharing an interest in kind of the confines of the body, or kind of bodies being misused by science or by the government in this case, or aliens and the government. And I think for me that was one of the most kind of compelling examples of it, certainly in this earlier series, I mean, like many long-running TV programs, towards the end, it doesn't quite do that as successfully. But I think that kind of balance between that kind of almost kind of playing with archetypes of horrific characters. There are Frankenstein type kind of characters. There are ghosts. There are there are vampires at different points. And I think the balance between those two different ways of kind of exploring the world as it was in kind of the 90s, particularly around as well kind of conspiracy theory, the idea that you couldn't trust people. I think it borrows from a lot of the kind of the examples that we've kind of talked about. And I think for me, bringing those together in a particular kind of narrative, and again, the point that Stacey made as well, being able to play around with that in a very, very long running kind of show, I think for me is still really, I think holds up quite well until around the 6th series. And then, yeah, not so much, but.
Mark, are there any you wanted to particularly highlight in it, perhaps in addition to ones we've already mentioned, because we already mentioned quite a few?
Yeah, I think Craig mentioning the Thing is really important, and positioning the Thing as part of a weird tradition that sort of predates American pulp science fiction magazines starting to set these commercial categories in place. So we have, unfortunate things like Lovecraft, who we, I guess, have to deal with, through in the UK to someone like Nigel Neal and a contemporary writer like Charlie Abel. But then films like Lucille Hadji-Halovich's Evolution, Ben Wheatley's In the Earth. These are films which, I was caught out by other people talking about them as horror movies. To me, I know, like Tetsuo, it's a science fiction movie. What do you mean it's a horror movie? And they really wrong foot me when people talk about them in this other generic framework. So I think they're really useful texts for me personally. In terms of TV, I would say old Doctor Who is just essential here, because it's absolute cavalier disregard of what other people think is important generically. It's written by people who don't care particularly about science fiction or horror or historicals. They are just mixing and mashing this stuff together, and it generates, a lot of crap, but also a lot of really, really good stuff as well. And then I would also throw in things like, because Event Horizon was mentioned, obviously Tarkovsky has to come up, as Event Horizon is basically a remake of Stalker with Hellraiser and other things thrown into the mix. But also a Japanese director like Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who moves quite astonishingly across genres. So there's early kind of slasher horror like Guard on the Underground, or wherever it translates as. Then there's that amazing succession of films, Pulse and Chaos and Doppelganger, which I have no idea where they fall generically. And then can do a straight up horror version of Parasite in Creepy. And then win a major prize at Cannes for a very nice film about playing the piano. I think a director like that can be really, really useful, because they're demonstrating constantly range and variety. And it's a challenge to us to think about how to process their films.
It's interesting you mentioned Tetsuo there, because I think that often gets bundled in with J-horror, doesn't it? And that can lead to the confusion around that. So it shows how sort of distribution, distribution consumption kind of networks can kind of have an impact here in terms of how different films are kind of classified, or different television programs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. When it was first shown in the UK, it was linked directly to Akira, which was the same season as a kind of Japanese science fiction, and that all fell away when people read David Lynch and David Cronenberg on the video case.
It's interesting. It's definitely interesting in terms of thinking about classification and also kind of cultural capital as well. Ewan, anything else that you wanted to particularly flag up as being an interesting example?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about, like, obviously my area is video games, and science fiction and horror amongst sort of like war and fantasy are probably kind of like the key video game genres, at least if we're thinking about kind of purely in terms of aesthetics. And a lot of titles do mash up horror and sci-fi, like the Resident Evil series, or Halo, Doom, lots of first-person shooters combine horror and science fiction. I guess for me, probably it might be because I've been writing about it recently. It could also be because we've been talking about Frankenstein. I think a key text is BioShock, which is set in an underwater city. It's a kind of like underwater high rise. It's this planned community that just become collapsed into civil war. It has science fiction elements to it, where you genetically modify your protagonists so that they can shoot bees out of their hands and shoot fire at will. But it also has kind of again, it's that way of like putting horror elements in, but there is some kind of very, very thin scientific or pseudo-scientific explanation for how you're actually able to do that. And it's a game, I guess, which is sort of rooted in sci-fi, but a lot of what it actually does is much more kind of horror. And it has explicit references to Frankenstein throughout the game. It's a game which is very clearly, we were talking about cultural capital earlier, and it's interesting. I think one of the reasons why that game is so highly regarded is because it has got those gestures towards literature as a way of kind of like framing what it's trying to do. But yeah, I would say the video game series BioShock.
Thanks, Ewan. And I will come back to you to talk a bit more about video games in a while, because that's definitely uncharted territory here that we need to think about a little bit more. Stacey, if before we move to that, have you got any examples you'd like to flag it?
I guess the two things I wanted to flag out were kind of briefly mentioned, but kind of very quickly, which is, I think I would flag up the works of Nigel Neal, who I think is really important. And Mark mentioned him, and I just want to kind of say it, like, I think partly because he's looking at, in a way, he's looking at the kind of supernatural world through science and through technology. And Stone Tape to me is a wonderful text that is terrifying, but it's all about technology and trying to explain visitations and hauntings in this kind of uncanny technology way. And I think that really is good. And then the other person, which, again, was mentioned in passing, is David Cronenberg, and I'm not just saying that because I'm Canadian and want to get the Canadian mentioned, but just Cronenberg is just, he's not interested in distinctions. He's not interested. He's making the films he's making, and he's interested in the body and in science and science gone mad and exploding heads and whatever. And I think so he just brings and weaves all this stuff together in really interesting ways. And I think you would be really hard pressed to disentangle the science fiction and horror from his work. And I think that's really important, because I think there's something that he is interested in, this vision that he has, and it's a messy one, and it's disturbing and it's unsettling, but it's also a celebration of science in his own way, and I think these are people, I think, who are pushing the boundaries of genre in really interesting ways.
And Brandon Cronenberg now as well, Possessor,
absolutely,
Antiviral, and the next one, whatever the next one's called, it's dropped out of my head.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Cronenberg's next film, Crimes of the Future, which is obviously a remake of Crimes of the Future, is being pitched as a horror film, despite the fact that it's quite clearly also a science fiction film, which is interesting.
Yeah. So sort of building on that, and in a way we've come full circle from starting with a very snarky comment from Stephen King to thinking very positively. And the next thing I was going to ask really is, can we think of genre hybridity ultimately as being this kind of very, very positive, progressive, creative force within popular genre traditions like science fiction and horror? I mean, Ewan has already said some really fascinating things about that, and what you were just saying about Cronenberg suggests that as well. I mean, Stacey, do you think that's the case, that ultimately hybridity is something that we absolutely should be celebrating, rather than policing boundaries, which is where we started, that actually hybridity keeps these genre traditions alive and keeps them culturally relevant, keeps them creative and expressive popular forms?
Absolutely. Simple answer is yes. But yeah, I think hybridity is how things evolve, change, shift. And again, it comes down to this idea of that. Well, I'm going to say particularly in film and television. I'm sure writers of literature would counter that. But I think in these kinds of media, they're interested in exploring ideas and stories, and mixing genres is how you kind of rethink it, push boundaries, change it, but also sell it. And I think, particularly with film and television, there's a thing about, well, and everyone knows I love Near Dark, and I've done a lot around Near Dark, and Catherine Bigelow talking about the fact she couldn't get a Western made, so she made a vampire Western. You know, that sometimes there's a sense of mixing genres because you think, well, look, this isn't going to sell right now, but this will, and then you do something really provocatively different. And so I think there is a real creative interplay that's going on that pushes boundaries.
Craig, have you got any thoughts on that, building on what Stacey just said?
First of all, that Brandon Cronenberg movie is called Infinity Pool, I've just remembered. But I think, it allows modern genre films to speak to us in ways that horror or science fiction alone couldn't. So one of the things I was thinking of in particular was the massive popularity of Contagion at the start of the pandemic. It was put on Netflix and suddenly found a whole new life. I think because it was speaking to us about the situation that we were in and allowing it, kind of giving a cathartic release for that. And I'm not sure I'd ever really seen anybody refer to Contagion as a horror film before that point, but it suddenly seemed to morph into one because of the situation that we were in. And I think increasingly, and this is actually partially answers a question that I saw in the chat, I'm not sure where it is now, but I think increasingly now that we're getting close to creating, intelligent AI, it really is helping us to think about some of the ethical issues involved in that as well. I mean, some people in the chat have mentioned Alex Garland a couple of times. I think Ex Machina is a really interesting film for how it kind of reckons with our messing with AI. And Annihilation came up in the chat as well, which I think is a really interesting kind of commentary on climate change. So, but the combination of those two genres allow us to work through a lot of cultural issues in a way that those two genres on their own can't. And in terms of being positive or progressive in a political sense, maybe I'll pass back to Stacey again after this, but I think of zombies because obviously they start as something from Haitian folklore, but a lot of the early films about zombies are enormously problematic and borderline racist, and the reimagining of zombies as something science fictional, caused by radiation or viruses or whatever, has allowed that monster to have a much longer and more varied life that maybe escapes some of those traps.
Stacey, any thoughts in response to that?
I just agree. I think, there's definitely the kind of reimagining in that science fiction way allowed to engage with the progressive kind of raising the big questions about what it means to be human and what it means, the monsters are us, and blurring those lines between the kind of othering of the zombie, which you do see in these early zombie films where it is very racially inscribed and kind of using it to other kind of in terms of race. Suddenly the zombie becomes something where we're saying, actually, we're all the zombies, where it's us, and those lines get blurred in a really interesting way because we all become the monster or the zombies, or depending on which zombie film, the zombies are the victims and it's really the humans who are the real monsters, and very quickly that becomes the kind of discourse of zombie texts.
I wanted to thanks everyone. I wanted, before we move to the end, to come back to the whole idea of different media forms and how these genres have developed and the relationships between them and how they've developed over time across different media forms. So I found that fascinating what Stacey and Rebecca were talking about earlier, this notion of that on television because of the nature of television and long form drama, that you can actually have different episodes that you would say are more horror or more science fiction. And I've never thought about that before, I have to confess. So that was fascinating. But I just wanted to get a sense, really, perhaps starting with Ewan, thinking perhaps about video games. Do you think that there is a specific kind of development in terms of the relationship between science fiction and horror that has emerged within video games as a specific media form, in terms of the kind of industrial context that distinguish video games as a media industry?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think genre in video games operates differently to the way that it operates in film or TV, and that's probably the same for any kind of medium. But one of the things that you're looking at when you're exploring the video game genres is the kind of mechanism of the game itself. So, for example, the first-person shooter is a game where you see things from a first person perspective and you run around shooting things. Now you can translate that into a Western or a horror film or a kind of science fiction setting, and it's still a first person shooter. So there is an argument that actually kind of like film and TV genres don't really get to the heart of video games because they're only really exploring the kind of aesthetics and not actually thinking about the kind of gameplay. I mean, that's quite a reductive argument, and one which I think has been sort of criticized quite a lot, but certainly it's one which is very strongly within video game scholarship. I mean, for me, one of the most interesting genres within video games in general is the survival horror one. And we talked earlier about the notion of going back to that Stephen King quote about, you know, what are we doing here? Why? I don't think anyone, I would hope no one here is sort of like policing boundaries and ensuring that, you know, you've got to categorize things the way that they ought to be. Otherwise, you're doing them some kind of disservice. But certainly in terms of like the survival horror genre, which is a interesting discursive formation that sort of emerges in the late 90s in response to the term actually being used in the first Resident Evil game. It coins the term survival horror, and then that is then used by subsequent video games to sort of label themselves. So you see the industry itself actually kind of taking hold of this particular subgenre and using it not only in terms of horror but also in terms of so not just in terms of the aesthetics, but also a particular kind of gameplay, which usually involves lots of hiding, lots of running away from monsters rather than shooting them. Quite often protagonists that have no weapons or are quite sort of weak and helpless. So there's a whole kind of series of kind of dynamics that are going on within that genre. And then you have Resident Evil 4, which comes out and actually kind of like on the cover of that box actually says, it effectively says, this is not a survival horror game. This is a survival action game. So then you've got the industry actually kind of like engaging with the generic terms which are already in play. And are being used by academics and journalists and by fans and by, you know, people talking about games. So in that respect, when we're thinking about genre hybridity, we're also thinking about fragmentation, so subgenres. And I just think it's a really interesting case study because it does show the ways, it does illustrate the way in which a generic term can be employed by the industry itself and played with until it's seen as no longer helpful, and then it is almost like the particular franchise feels the need to almost kind of abject that particular category and move on to something else.
So that's fascinating, thank you. And sort of jumping from that, because we're talking there about the industry and the role of the industry in this process, this whole process of genre classification. And we've already touched on it, but I just wanted to think a little bit more about audiences and fans as well, and what their role is here. So, you know, Craig mentioned Contagion, for instance, and the fact that was almost embraced as a kind of horror film by audiences, presumably during the pandemic. So, Rebecca, if you don't mind, I'll come to you as kind of my fellow audience researcher on the panel here. You know, what role do you think audiences and fans play in all of this? You know, do they play key roles just in the ways that the industry do or distributors do in defining media texts as science fiction, horror, as hybrid forms? You know, what role for you do they play in this? Do they play an important role?
I think they do. I think they're for the industry. I think fans, particularly very vocal fans, can be a good barometer of what people like and what they don't like at the very most basic level. And I think that we see that much more with, you know, online feedback is immediate. You know, so even 15, 20 years ago, it would take a lot longer to work out what is being received well, how are people responding to it. So I think the wider audience has that really important role to play. And I think you can see that from the way that, particularly in horror, there might be a kind of resurgence in certain kinds of subgenre. And then you can sort of see, I think, when that sort of starts to tail off, when actually people start to become bored of that. And then, you know, you have to go back and innovate again and kind of hybridize again and kind of come back with something new. But I think to come back to the idea of cultural capital, there's sort of been underneath a lot of what we've talked about this evening. I think fans are very important in forming different kinds of canon of their own. We talked a lot about certain texts, which, you know, although we would probably all reject the idea of the notion of canons, they do exist in terms of what we talk about, what we analyze. And I think fans play a really important role in that. And sometimes the things that fans might value or hold up as good examples of either science fiction or horror might not necessarily be what the industry expects. It might not necessarily be something that maybe sort of the wider media or film critics, for example, have enjoyed. And I think we see that certainly, as sort of mentioned earlier, when we get into some of the more subcultural kind of trashy, really kind of, you know, slasher, splatter movies that that people, particularly sort of through the 80s and into the 90s, were kind of holding up as examples, not of good films necessarily, but as good examples of particular genres. So I think they do have a really important role to play. And I think the one kind of note of caution that I would sound, which is I think something that a lot of people who study fans are kind of highlighting, is that fans aren't just there to serve the industry and be, you know, the guiding light for what the industry should be doing, that they do need to be kind of seen as more than that. So I think it's really important, and they are, I think, really important to in that way, but also that they are not just there to kind of provide free labor or kind of free focus groups to kind of let them know what they should and shouldn't be doing, because I think that's a dangerous path for audience and fan researchers to kind of go down.
Couldn't agree more, Rebecca. And I think, you know, I could continue this discussion with you all for a very long time, but I'm conscious of the fact that the chat has been going bonkers all evening, and that people have been putting really, really valuable comments and questions in the chat. So I'm just going to go through some of the key questions that we got tonight during the discussion. And the first one's from Matt Hills. Hi, Matt. Matt is asking a really good question here. He's saying, how do people think fantasy fits into or relates to this whole issue of science fiction, horror, genre distinctions? Anybody want to take that question?
I'll give it a go.
Go for it, Mark.
As someone who works primarily in science fiction, fantasy is the bad other. That's how the discipline of science fiction studies has always treated it, because of its, probably more so even than horror, because of its connection to feudalism, to hierarchy, to the irrational, all those things combined, which are very, very foregrounded, most obviously in the sword and sorcery heroic fantasy tradition. But of course, fantasy is much larger than that. And one of the great reconciliations to have happened in this century is certainly in prose fiction, that border has eroded massively. That science fiction studies now does actually respect fantasy rather than treating it as a bad other, not uniformly, not, you know, or anything like that, but you get the rise of authors like Nora Jemisin and so on, who work brilliantly across that boundary. Of course, I think the distinction in terms of film and television, for the most part, has never been held as being as important as it has been to the prose fiction tradition, which has to do with the particular construction of American commercial publishing categories in the 20s and 30s, and the ways in which fandoms and readerships bought into that construction. So that was rambly. Did I even answer the question in there? I said something about fantasy. That'll do.
I think you did. I think it was a fascinating answer. Thank you. We've also got a question from Kev Bickerdike. Hi, Kev. And he's asking, do the panel feel that science fiction is seemingly less categorically subjective than horror, given how ambiguous the horror element often is? So he's saying, I suppose sci-fi seems to need particular narrative elements, whereas horror has to an extent moved away from aesthetic and narrative conventions or cliches. What do people think? Any thoughts in response to that? Ewan?
I guess, I mean, if we're going to think about those, what that term actually means, horror suggests an impact on the viewer it implies that this is something which is which is felt by the reader or the player or the viewer. So I mean, someone mentioned Jaws earlier, which I wouldn't have thought of as a horror film, but I guess if it horrifies, then it is. I guess I'm not sure if that sort of answers the question, but I think science fiction does seem to be related as a term to the content of in terms of genre, whereas horror, and of course, there are other subgenres like the ghost story, the kind of the slasher movie. Those are maybe more related to narrative content, whereas horror as a term seems to be much more about affect than about the narrative.
That's very true. Sorry, I'm rattling through these questions because there's so many, and I want to make sure I get them all covered. Reese Goodall, hi Reese. He's asking, this is a question for everyone. Do you think, this is sort of building actually from what you've just said, Ewan, do you think there are effective similarities between the two genres? I know that horror more obviously encourages emotions like fear and disgust, as well as fascination with difference. But could similar effective responses be useful for thinking about science fiction?
I would jump in here. I mean, I think I saw in the chat somewhere, maybe in response to that, someone talked about the science fiction is often attributed to this notion of wonder versus horror. But I would say that actually, particularly in film and television, that's one emotional affect of horror, of science fiction. But I think there is, I would keep coming back to this notion of the sublime and this idea that attached to that wonder is horror, or the kind of inverse of that, which is there's something that is arguably overwhelming about what we're looking at, that can be both wondrous but also horrific or frightening or overwhelming. And I think there's something about that kind of excess that they both do in terms of emotional excess, in terms of how we're responding to what we're looking at, that there is something that really is connecting these two in terms of affect, more than just seeing them as kind of emotionally opposite poles, saying actually there's something they both tap into, which is about kind of overwhelming the audience emotionally, in an effective way.
I think that kind of speaks to where science fiction and horror come from. They both come from that mad science tradition. And in the 1950s, so much of it is about fear of nuclear annihilation, and it's being overwhelmed by what science could do to us. And I think science, fear has been as much a part of science fiction as it has a part of horror.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would add there is, as well, the other thing that I was thinking as I was listening to the question is, and it's not necessarily an emotional response, but I think one thing we haven't touched on really is the notion of spectacle. Because we're talking about film and television, video games, and spectacle is a big part of both of these genres, and fantasy, that it links them, that there's something about what we're looking at and how we're responding to these spectacles that I think they all have in common. They're confronting us with something that we may or may not find pleasurable, or we may find pleasurable in strange ways, but that there is something effective about about how we're engaging with these audiovisual images.
I think that relates as well to your focus on the body earlier, Stacey, and also to special effects, and the fact that we have this extraordinary craft of special effects, which is developed to a significant degree between these two genres and across them, which fits with this whole notion of spectacle, I think.
Absolutely.
Question from Vincent Gain. Hi Vincent, quite a long question but really fascinating one. Could the superhero genre work as a counterpoint here to horror? Superhero narratives are often science fiction based, but the science gone wrong leads to the creation of heroic rather than malevolent figures and forces. There was a mention of the nuclear horrors of the 1950s, and many Marvel characters are related to radiation. But thinking back to what Stacey said about the body, these bodies are also monstrous, a point that film adaptations often emphasise by showing alterations to the body, now that bodies can be digitised. Bodies are made monstrous by science gone wrong. Go one way and we have horror, go another way and we have a superhero, ? Any thoughts and responses to that?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, and I suppose it relates to stuff like Swamp Thing, where He's a superhero, but it's also playing on that horror element. I think I would agree. Some superheroes that have been turned into what they are through science have been imagined as horror monsters. I mean, there's a comic book series currently running, or maybe is just finished, but it's called the Immortal Hulk, and I've never read a comic more kind of horrific. But I did, yeah. Generally speaking, I think I would agree that the superhero genre is perhaps a more hopeful way of looking at what happens to the human body when science plays with it. Yeah.
Just jumping in, I would say I agree, but I think again it depends on the superhero text, because I think often superhero texts do play with the horrific element of it before they come to accept the power and the benefits of it and see themselves as heroes. So, often think of those moments of transformation, and those moments. I was thinking of things like the Fantastic Four, when they all get kind of whatever it is that happens to them, I've forgotten, and then suddenly they see their bodies change, and they're having to deal with this, and some more monstrous than others, but suddenly having to deal with the horror of that happening to them. And I do think I really appreciate the point about special effects here in digital. And I think there's an interesting line a lot of these films walk with showing the body being transformed in kind of terrifying ways and being manipulated in really disturbing ways, and then rendered powerful, then discovered actually there's a benefit to this. Some text smooth that out, so Captain America adjusts very quickly to the phenomenally radical transformation of his body and seems to adapt really easily. Others, perhaps, the Hulk is a great example, someone who struggles with that all the time in his narrative. So I think they're playing it's a really interesting series of texts alongside all of these.
The Hulk and Swamp Thing are essentially body horror narratives. They're just body horror narratives that eventually morph into superhero narratives. I mean, the early Hulk comics, he was largely the villain, the Hulk was, and Bruce Banner was the hero, and that's been reflected in a lot of the cinematic adaptations, I think.
Yeah. And I just put in a word for the first 2/3 of Josh Trank's Fantastic Four, the only superhero movie that's tried to do anything interesting in recent memory, and was of course destroyed by the studio for doing so.
I'm really glad that Vincent asked this question, because that was really fascinating set of answers there. Thank you, everyone. I've got a question from Kate Maloney. Hi, Kate, who's saying, following on from the discussion about shared themes, do the panel think that there are any key ideas or themes which have emerged as being more visible in kind of contemporary 21st century hybrid text? To some extent, we've just addressed that, I think, by thinking about the recent superhero movies and their focus on spectacle and the body and transformation. But are there any other kind of key themes or ideas which seem particularly contemporary when thinking about the crossover between science fiction and horror?
I think now definitely viral outbreaks of various descriptions, either pre or post COVID. I think that's definitely something that's come to the fore. Climate disaster, environmental disaster, which obviously Mark can speak to a lot more. And to me, the pervading one has been technology. I'm not, this might be controversial, I'm not a massive Black Mirror fan. I find it a little bit too technophobic and maybe a little bit too regressive, but I think it epitomizes where we are in terms of, texts that look at the dangers and the horrors of technology and where technology might take us. So yeah, I think for me, the pervading one over the last 15, 20 years has definitely been AI technology and where that might take us, I think.
I've got a really interesting question here from Darren Elliott Smith. Hi, Darren. And he says, I've been working a lot with some postgraduate students recently on the development of Frankenstein narrative into trans queer structures, and how science fiction horror can speak about the trans embodied experience in recent films like Titan, for example. Do the panel think sci-fi narratives around the pathologizing or medicalizing of difference is useful in doing this for queer spectators or stories?
I'd be honestly just really interested to hear Darren talk about that. If he's interested in doing so.
maybe this is a topic for a future session, quite possibly. I think that it's a very rich area, and there's a lot we could discuss in relation to that.
I mean, I have so many thoughts, and I don't have the coherent response, but I do think there is something really interesting about the ways in which, I think texts that we take for granted in terms of how they deal with the body and deal with that can now are being reread and rethought of through a kind of a trans perspective, and suddenly rethinking this. And I have a former student who I think was here somewhere, I'm not sure if they're still here, talking about kind of MPreg fiction and fan fiction, about this whole kind of the pathologizing of the kind of pregnant male body, which suddenly becomes much more complicated, which becomes much more complicated when you look through a trans body perspective. So if Mars, you're here, feel free, thank you for making me think about that in ways I hadn't thought about. So I think there's a lot that we're now in a position to start unpacking in ways that can be helpful. But I think for a lot of people, we're still thinking of it. Thank you, Mars. We're starting to work through. We need and starting to think through these ideas. So it's a lot to talk about. And you're right. I think there are future events in this kind of thing.
Definitely. I've got a question from Barnaby here. Hi, Barnaby, and it's mostly for Ewan, but open to others as well. And he's asking, what do you think of the recent Resident Evil games aesthetics? He says, I've noticed that that RE1 plus 7/8 really play up on traditional Gothic elements while still keeping the science fiction plot.
Okay, I was really worried about this question because I'm not very familiar with the more recent Resident Evil games. But I mean, it is an interesting franchise. I mean, it has gone in lots of different directions. The first game is very much a kind of haunted house narrative, and then I think the second one is where it really sort of starts to go down a very kind of Romero pathway. Then starts to shift into sort of Eastern Europe as this kind of like othered space. And the last one that I tried, I had to give up because I just found it so uncomfortable to play, is Resident Evil 5, which is set in Africa and does have some fairly kind of like grotesque racist imagery in it. So I mean, I was really interested. It's interesting that there's, as a franchise, it's always kind of reinventing itself. So there's a lot of remakes of old games which are being circulated. But I think as a classic survival horror text, it definitely has its roots very, very squarely in the Gothic.
Fantastic. Considering you were worried about answering that question, that's a great response.
Managed to get away with it.
Has anyone else got any comments on Resident Evil? Anyone else wanted to pitch in with a comment?
It's not about Resident Evil per se, actually, but I've been thinking, listening to the kind of the conversation, the discussion around the video games, and just trying to think this back to what I've been researching more recently, which is kind of physical media experiences, and how I think both horror certainly, but also kind of science fiction, how common it is for things like immersive experiences, theme park rides, kind of pop-up kind of immersive experiences tend to draw particularly on those genres. And I think that a lot of that comes back to that experience of kind of quite physically being able to experience some of that kind of awe or wonder or kind of being frightened or being kind of horrified in different ways. Certainly with horror, there are limits to that because you can't genuinely be terrified, and you're not in any kind of real danger. But I do think that there's really interesting developments that are happening around kind of the gamification of media experience more broadly, that's borrowing from video games, from kind of cinema, from film. And I'm kind of just thinking this through tonight now, and I wonder whether that's something that maybe is kind of worth looking at, because haunted houses have an exceptionally long history of kind of wanting to physically be frightened, and that's just something that's been kind of popping into my head when we've been talking about the kind of video game experience as well.
You're right, and I'm really glad you raised that, because it extends the examples that we're looking at beyond film, television, video games, to think about wider cultural experiences that that draw on the two genres in different ways. So that's fascinating, and I'm glad it's got you thinking about that, this discussion. I know that this discussion has got me thinking about all sorts of things, and it's been an absolute pleasure listening to you all, and really thought-provoking evening. And I think, you know, there's so much that's been raised in the last 90 minutes that I think we could have a kind of sequel to this event potentially in the future, and to discuss some of these issues further. So just want to, Shelley and Laura have indicated it in the chat, but to thank all of you for taking part tonight. It's been really, really productive and pleasurable experience to sort of combine forces in this way, and I hope it's the first of many occasions where we do so. So thank you everybody for taking part in the panel, and also thank you to everybody in the chat as well who's been commenting throughout the course of this discussion. It's been one of the liveliest chats I can remember for an event, certainly for our horror study SIG. So thank you everyone for your comments and thoughts, which have been really, really valuable and have fed into this very rich discussion. So thank you everybody, and we'll see you for the next event for the horror study SIG and for the science fiction SIG. But we do hope, as I say, that we will be joining forces again in the near future. So thanks everyone, and all the best, and speak to you soon. Have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.